So in the last lesson, we found out that energy enters an ecosystem through the plants. The plants take that energy from sunlight, and they take other reactants and they turn it into sugar, into glucose. And now that energy has entered the ecosystem and it's now existing as sugar that other things can eat, and it can move through the ecosystem. In this lesson, we'll look at how that energy now moves throughout the ecosystem. So the flow of energy in an ecosystem involves an interaction between many different living things. So there's a bunch of interactions between plants and animals and different types of animals that allows that energy to flow through the ecosystem. So we're going to take all of the living things in an ecosystem, all of the biotic factors, and we're going to break them into two categories. We're going to call them either producers or consumers. All right, so producers, these are all of the plants, and producers are things that get their energy by making their own food. So producers are all of the plants, all of the trees and bushes and grasses. These things make their own food by doing photosynthesis, and they're making glucose, they're making sugar. All of the other things are consumers. So these are really all of the insects and rodents and larger animals. Those are all consumers. Now, we can break consumers down into a couple of different categories. So some consumers are called herbivores. These ones get their energy by eating plants. So these ones get their energy by eating producers, right? Because producers are plants. So see if you can think of an example of a herbivore. All right, some examples might be a deer. A deer only eats plants. It's a herbivore. It only eats producers. Grasshoppers. Grasshoppers only eat plants. Those are all herbivores. And that's generally the next stage of the energy, right? Because the energy is now moved from the plant and the deer has eaten the plant. So now that deer has the glucose, it has the sugar, it has the energy. All right. Another example of a consumer could be a carnivore. Carnivore, they get their energy by eating other consumers. So for example, a carnivore might be something like a wolf. A wolf is a consumer because it doesn't make its own food, and it's a carnivore because it would eat other consumers. A wolf would eat a deer, and it would get its energy that way. So carnivores generally only eat meat. Right? A wolf would generally get its energy by eating deer and small rodents. Omnivore, these ones can get energy by eating either plants, producers, or other animals, other consumers. So for example, a bear is an omnivore. A bear will eat berries, but it would also eat a salmon, right? So it will eat plants and animals. And it can get energy in both of those ways. And last category is a decomposer. So a decomposer gets its energy by breaking down dead organisms or animal waste. And examples of decomposers are things like worms, mushrooms. Right? When an animal dies, that energy doesn't just disappear. The decomposers will break that energy back down. They'll take that energy from breaking down the dead animal or from the animal's waste. Now, all of these things, these are all consumers because they're not making food. They're not making glucose. They're getting it from something else. The herbivore gets it from eating plants. The carnivore gets it by eating other animals. The omnivore gets it from eating plants or animals. The decomposer gets it from dead things, from breaking them down. So the producers allow the energy, the to enter the ecosystem by making glucose, and then that energy is transferred throughout that ecosystem by all of these things eating either the plants or each other or breaking them down. And we'll look at some diagrams that kind of show this better, right? Because this is just a bunch of different terms, but we'll look at some diagrams shortly. There's kind of one more term that you'll hear, and it's called the ecological niche. So the role that a species serves, kind of its job in the ecosystem, is called an ecological niche. So each species has its own role, its own ecological niche. So for example, a plant's ecological niche is to bring energy into an ecosystem by making glucose, by absorbing sunlight and making glucose. A deer's role in an ecosystem is to change that plant into, or to eat that plant, right? And a carnivore's role in the ecosystem is to eat other producers and also provide a source, when that carnivore dies, provide a source for worms and mushrooms to break itself down. So each species has its own role, and they usually rely on each other. All right, so let's try and draw some diagrams showing some of these things. All right, so the simplest diagram is called a food chain, just a single chain of things. And a food chain shows the feeding relationship in an ecosystem. Okay, so here's a simple food chain. You have pine cone, which has a bunch of seeds in it. The red squirrel feeds on that. It eats the pine cones. The weasel then eats the red squirrel, and this hawk eats the weasel. So in this case, this is the feeding relationship, and it goes in this sort of order, right? Now, this is also the order that the energy goes, right? Because the tree absorbs the sunlight and it brings in the energy by making glucose, which is in the seeds. The squirrel then eats the seeds and it gets its sugar from that. The weasel then eats the squirrel and it gets its sugar, its energy from that. And the hawk eventually eats the weasel and gets its energy from that. And when the hawk then dies, the decomposers would break that down and they would get their energy from that. Now, this is just a single food chain. In a forest, in an ecosystem, there would be a whole bunch of these different food chains happening at the same time. Right? There's probably something else that eats these pine cone seeds. And there's probably something else that eats the red squirrel, right? So there's actually a bunch of these food chains mixed together. But you can just look at a single chain at a time if you want to. All right, the other thing we can talk about is trophic levels. So a trophic level shows the position of an organism in a food chain. So is it at the beginning of the food chain? Is it in the middle? Is it at the end of the food chain? Right? So where do these things show up, right? Where do pine cones normally show up? Well, they normally show up at the beginning of a food chain. Where does a hawk show up? It normally shows up at the end of a food chain, right? So it's a way of showing where these things generally show up in the food chain. And we just go and we just put them in kind of an order, and we say that the lowest level is called the first trophic level. So the first trophic level, these are the things that are always at the beginning of a food chain. And they're always the producers because that's where the energy comes in. So at the beginning of a food chain, you'll always have grasses, berries, seeds, plants. These things are all first trophic levels, they're producers. The things that eat them are called you go to the next trophic level, the second trophic level. And we call these primary consumers, the first things that eat these. Mice, deer, a moose. That's the next level that the energy goes to, because those plants now get their glucose, their energy, their sugar from eating the plants. Now, the next thing is the next trophic level is the things that would eat these. So, right, our weasel, right, might eat the mouse. The snake might eat the mouse. So we call this the third trophic level. We call them secondary consumers because they're now the next consumers, right? And even above that would be the larger animals, the tertiary, so the fourth trophic level, next level up, the tertiary consumers. So right, so here's our hawk that might eat the weasel. So it's a way of just showing where they show up in the food chain. Right? Generally, these show up at the beginning, or these have to show up at the beginning of the food chain. Generally, they show up as the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. Now, one of the important roles of these trophic levels is to talk about energy. And each time you go up one step, only 10% of the energy is actually taken in by the organisms at one trophic level higher. So we say only 10% of the energy is passed on to the next trophic level. So you get all of these plants growing, and only 10% of the energy of the glucose that's stored in those plants is actually passed on to animals. The rest just stays in the plants, and it's either used by the plants or the plant dies. And then decomposers would break those plants down. Okay, so now you have all of these animals that have eaten these plants, 10% of the energy in the plants. And if you go up another level, only 10% of the energy that's stored in all of these animals is passed on to the next animals. And once again, only 10% of the energy is passed on to the next level. So as you move up trophic levels, you get less and less energy available. And that's also why there are less individual animals, less organisms at each trophic level. Right? You have a whole bunch of different plants and berries and bushes. And as you go up the next level, there's still quite a lot of primary consumers, right? There's quite a lot of mice and deer and things like that. But then you go up a next level and there's a little bit less, right? Because now, right, now your weasel is probably going to need to eat a bunch of mice to survive. And then you go up even another level and there's only a small amount of these animals, right? Because your hawk needs to eat a bunch of weasels to survive, and your weasel needs to eat a bunch of mice to survive, and your mice needs to eat a bunch of plants to survive, right? So as you move up, you get less and less organisms because they rely on so many more organisms below them to survive, and because only 10% of that energy is being passed on. The trophic level is really showing that energy transfer, and only 10% of energy moves up. All right, food web. Now, we mentioned earlier that there's actually a bunch of food chains going on in an ecosystem at once. So if you took a forest ecosystem, there's a bunch of different food chains happening. And you can show them using a food web. So a food web shows a series of interconnecting food chains. It really shows the feeding relationship within a community. All right, so here's an example. Probably some sort of forest ecosystem. So right, you can look through, if you follow the arrows, you can look at a single food chain, right? Okay, so wild grass is eaten by a snowshoe hare. A snowshoe hare is eaten by a hawk, and a hawk could be eaten by a great owl. Right? Just by following the arrows, you can look at a single food chain. The pine tree, the pine cones are eaten by the red squirrel. The red squirrel is eaten by the weasel. The weasel is eaten by the hawk. We saw that one earlier, right? And that single food chain is in there. But there's also a bunch of other ones happening at the same time, right? The pine cone is eaten by the red squirrel, who could just be immediately eaten by the hawk. The pine cone is also eaten by the rabbit, which is eaten by the hawk. Right? So all these food chains are intertwined together. Now, not every single animal is shown on the food web. It's generally the most common ones in that ecosystem. Now, having all of these interconnections, it actually gives a little bit of stability to the ecosystem, because if there is a small change, right? Let's say there's something that causes, you know, that causes some of the red squirrels to die that year, um, the ecosystem was probably going to be okay because it might balance out by, if there's less red squirrels, now there's going to be more pine cones available, and now there might be a little bit more snowshoe hare around. Now, since there's less red squirrels available, there isn't as much available for the hawk to eat, but now the hawk can probably eat some more snowshoe hares instead. And there's probably more of them because there's more pine cones available for them to eat. So, as long as it's small changes, the ecosystem can balance itself out. And that interconnection actually allows it to balance itself better. But if there's a massive change to the ecosystem, as soon as one of the things fails, if something fails completely in an ecosystem, the whole ecosystem could collapse. So for example, if the red squirrels were completely wiped out of this ecosystem, well, now suddenly the weasel wouldn't have anything to eat. So now your weasels would completely die out. And now your hawks would rely completely on the snowshoe hare, since it wouldn't have weasels or red squirrels to eat. And is there going to be enough snowshoe hare available for it to only eat those? Probably not. Right? So if there's a massive change to an ecosystem and one thing fails in it, that can lead to the entire ecosystem collapsing. If there's just a small change, the ecosystem adapt to it. If there's a massive change, it can't. And there are cases of ecosystems collapsing in the past. Easter Island is an example of an ecosystem collapsing. Here's another example of a food web. This is an aquatic one. Right? So it's showing aquatic plants and insects. Right? Plants that are growing underneath a lake, for example, or maybe algae that's growing in a lake. Those are all producers. Then we have our primary consumers, right? So the things that are eating these plants. And then we have our secondary consumers, right? Things that are eating those. Now, in this food chain, you'll notice that they've actually thrown in an extra thing here with these red arrows, the rusty crawfish. And in this case, this food web in this ecosystem was doing fine with all of the black arrows, right? They were kind of going the right direction. The energy was going from the producers into the primary consumers and into the secondary consumers. But this new animal was introduced to this ecosystem called the rusty crayfish. And this animal is not naturally found in this area. This ecosystem is actually for lakes in North America. And this rusty crawfish is not found in North American lakes, but it was accidentally brought here by humans. And what happened is when that crayfish was introduced into this lake, it actually eats all of these things. It eats all of these plants, and it also eats small fish as well. So what happens is it actually started to do really well in North American lakes, and its population exploded, and you just started finding a huge amount of rusty crayfish in some of these lakes. And what happens is it actually kind of screws up this ecosystem, or screws up this food web, because it's eating the producers and some of the consumers, and even some of the young for the secondary consumers. So now all of a sudden it's changing the balance that was there in the ecosystem. Now, and we call this an invasive species because it doesn't naturally show up. But when it was introduced to this ecosystem, it began pulling, or it began consuming many different things and really screwing up the balance that was in that food web.